We'll start. Um, okay. First of all, thank you all for coming. As those who were here last week, I'm just going to let you know, the very beginning, I'm going to repeat just so that people get a sense of the ground rules in the conversation. I know there's some new faces here. Um, so I just want to start. I'm going to share the screen. Um, and just 1 second, so I can, uh, so I can actually get to, it's not letting me do this. Hold on 1 second. Oh, there we go. Slideshow. Okay. All right. So just to set, just so I'm calling them ground rules, just to restate, there's never been a single right way to pray in Jewish tradition. Not only do we today have multiple versions of the Siddur, the differences between the Siddurim
Like trying to get something that's
can be
blind there.
vast. And the differences between how people approach what is the content of prayer can also be vast. And the story I told about the Litvak rabbi and the Misnagid rabbi just before, and the Hasidic rabbi and the guy cleaning the wagon wheels, I think is just one version of it. And one of the things we'll actually see today, briefly, are some of the mystical traditions in the
I'm
texts
gonna start the screen
that come
sharing off so we can't
alongside
do
our prayer service. Um, that come alongside the prayer services, so that way, so that you can see just people really approach it as a different kind of tool, depending on which community you're in and what tradition you're following. And then additionally, whatever we discuss here, hopefully it resonates with you, but as a corollary to what I just said, that if it doesn't work, it's okay to disagree, and I'd love to hear your version of tefillah and how you relate to it. Um, Also, as I talked about last week, the G word, God. I'm very comfortable with God language. I very, and really, I've throughout my life have had different opinions on God and the existence of God. I recognize that for each one of us, we all have multiple ways of thinking about God. Although, as for prayer, it's kind of hard to talk about prayer without having a direction. But what I want to say is that, whether you have God, whether you believe in God in a very sort of literal classical sense, whether you see God in a metaphorical sense or in a mystical sense, in a way that doesn't fit within those classic understandings, or if you don't relate to the idea of God at all, you're all welcome here, and your approach is valued here. Fundamentally, I believe we can't reduce God to a single idea. And I also think that we live in a vast universe and we stand in front of the infinite, and we have to be humble in that moment. And different people will have different ways of approaching that moment, that idea. And then finally, just ways in which, if we talk about God, or we talk about something else that is perhaps a similar concept, or however you want to understand spirituality, there are just a couple ways in which I think the idea of God, since it can't be reduced to one thing, I think the idea of God helps, or whatever parallel idea that you have, could work in its stead. So, whatever gives you purpose, gets you up in the morning, whatever gives you that sense of this is right and wrong, the ways in which you take gratitude and recognize that there's something good in the world, the idea that the world is created for goodness, tov, v'ra Elohim ki tov, God saw the world was good. um, Ways in which you can have better understanding of yourself and who you are, get in touch with your soul, your deepest parts of your personality, and then transcendence, the ways in which you recognize that your life is limited or who you are is limited. There's something beyond you. That these are five different places where the idea of God, I think, influences people, and it could be in very different ways each. And that whether or not God is the word that you use for that, or there's some other idea or concept, however you approach it, we love you, you're here, and I'm so happy to see you. Um, okay. Uh, I'm going to start, as I think it was Hal had mentioned at the beginning, there's a name. There are different ways that people refer to the Amidah. So there's the Amidah, which literally means standing, which we'll talk about a lot because posture and the choreography is important. There's Shmone Esrei, which means the 18, which um, are the amount of blessings in the weekday Amidah. Happens to be the amount of blessings is actually 19. But according to tradition, there was a blessing that was added. There is some real discussion over which exact blessing was added, because some earlier Sidurim may have sort of different versions of what that 18 was. Um, there's Tefillah, which in classical sources, when you say tefillah, you're really only talking about the Amidah as part of the service, even though today we often talk about tefillah referring to the whole service or other parts of the service. Then there's avodah, avodah, which itself means service. And that word in particular, I think, reflects the historical connection between prayer service and the temple service, which wasn't necessarily prayer, which often involved sacrifices as well, but that there is some connection there. Okay, that makes sense. Um, I'm just going to say because I am sharing my screen, I can't necessarily see if you have your hand up or anything like that. So if anyone has a question or wants to interrupt with something, help each. If I'm not responding, um, you know, I either speak up or also somebody else can speak up also to help each other out because not everyone is comfortable speaking up. Okay, okay. Want to just read this. I mentioned it last week, but I think fundamentally, when we're talking about prayer, especially the Amidah, there's this pageantry to it. There's this sense of that what you're doing is symbolically or metaphorically or literally, depending on your opinion on it, standing before a king and the King of Kings. And here's just one way in which we see it even in our halachic tradition, the tradition of Jewish law, which is an interesting ruling about being drunk and praying. If one drank wine in the amount of a revit, about a third a cup, should not pray until the wine is passed from him. And if he drank more than that, if he is able to speak before a king, then if he prayed, say after the fact, initially you shouldn't pray in that circumstance according to this text of the Shulchan Aruch, but let's say you did it anyway. If you're able to recite it in a way that you could recite it before a king, then the prayer is valid. But if he is not able to speak before a king, if you're stumbling or if you're speaking in a slurring or speaking in a way that you wouldn't be caught dead speaking to somebody, like a king. Um, then if you prayed, your prayer is an abomination. Just sorry, strong language. You must return and pray again once the wine is passed from it. Okay, just going to stop sharing for a moment. I want to just add that also in that's one source, but it's all over Jewish literature, and especially Hasidic literature goes into it. This idea that when you are praying, when you're doing the Amidah, you are standing in front of a king. Um, First, what do people think of that metaphor? Any responses? That is a metaphor. You're standing in front of a king. Does that work for you?
That's an odd one.
Yeah, it's better. We're here in
If you
America,
drink a
especially.
little, you can't pray, but if you drink more and you can handle it, go ahead.
Right. Well, no, it's such a like I think like if you're drinking enough, like and the king's there, like okay, you gotta talk, but I do like to think of the idea that you shouldn't show up to the prayer service, more drunk than you would say showing up to a job interview, or something where like no, I'm taking this seriously. At least that's what I think this halacha is teaching us. There are exceptions like Purim, where a lot of people drink as part of the practice of Purim. That can, that can be that can change things. But I'm just in general, the metaphor of a king here, especially here in America, like, does that work for people? Any, any- no?
Well, isn't the king a metaphor for God?
Yes. Yes.
So I mean, you go by the times.
You go by the so I'm wondering like to what like I think that's a good point. Like, are we going by the time we're saying
Once
this
it's in use,
prayer
I'll
is
let you
an
know.
older prayer, and we recognize, we may not have kings in America, or without getting political, to any all who attend No Kings rallies, um, but like we may not be sort of pro monarchy in America, but is the metaphor still work to explain the experience that they're trying to evoke? Because God is also not a king, like certainly not a human king. I'm gonna so I'll add to this. Some of you've I've told the story of the Chassid who lived in Russia. Um, I finally found the name of who they think may be the source of this teaching is Michal Blinner, who said that after the Tsar was assassinated, um, that we lost the metaphor for King of Kings, that we don't that we've that fear that would keep the people and the populace from uprising, from an uprising, that we've sort of lost that. We live in a world that is, and he's recognized we live in a world that has changed. Monarchies are just not the fashion anymore. And that had an influence on how we relate to prayer. Um, so I just wanted to point that out, put that out there. Okay. Anyone else just on this metaphor? All right, if not, we can go on. All right. All right, just trying to get it to actually. All right, for some reason my screen share isn't working properly. Give me 1 second and I will get it right back to it. Okay.
You should be good now if you look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just okay. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is just the structure of the Amidah. And just the first thing, just to, because especially if you're following along, and I said one of the things that I want to come out of this for people when you're sitting in services, to be able to follow along, to be able to get something out of this, so that you're not just sitting there gritting your teeth, thinking like I'm sitting through a service, I'm kind of lost. Um, First of all, the Amidah is like many other prayers in the Siddur. It is a series of blessings. It's a blessing series, and what I mean by that is that it's a particular way in which prayers were written, and blessings in particular are written, where there are blessings one after the other, often in paragraphs. Um, so, and the way in which it's set up is that each blessing, each paragraph ends with what's called a seal or a chatimah, beginning with the words Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you Adonai, or praised are you Adonai. Is how I don't like the translation praised are you for Baruch, but that's what they use in the Siddur that we use at Anshe Emet. Um, and the very opening blessing also begins with Baruch atah Adonai. Um, so let me share a different document so you can see what I'm talking about here. Um, okay, we just go up to the beginning. Okay, people will recognize this page from services. Um, if you look here, this is the opening blessing. And I'll in services we'll start, Baruch atah Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu. So this Baruch atah Adonai here, or praised are you, O Lord, here, that's the very first blessing, and that's the opening mark. That's the opening of it, the pticha, the opening. And then here, the end of this first blessing, this first paragraph, ends again with a blessing beginning with Baruch atah Adonai, or praised are you, O Lord. Right? And if you go through, you'll see each one. So the next paragraph ends with a blessing, Baruch atah Adonai. And I'm gonna and here this section ends. The Kedusha ends again. Baruch atah Adonai, or praised are you, O Lord. And if I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you'll see each section will end with Baruch atah Adonai, and sometimes it could be several paragraphs. Like on Shabbat, there are 3 or 4 paragraphs that you recite before you say the Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Okay, that makes sense. Right, that's just the structural piece. So that you know where you have a sense of how things work. Um, Back and forth sharing.
Rabbi, so what's the difference between a prayer and a blessing?
Right. So I would, to me, I don't see a major difference. What a blessing is just is a formula, is a particular formula of prayer. So we'll see actually here. Let me just go back to that for a second. So here, if I go, we continue with the Amidah, and I'll show you an example of what I would call a prayer, but it wouldn't count as a blessing. Um, Here, so at the very end of the Amidah, we have this line, "O Lord, guard my tongue from evil, Elohai nitzor lashoni me'ra," and this is the very end of the Amidah. Um, Ends with "Oseh shalom bimromav." You know, it's not in the language of a blessing. It's not in the language of Baruch. And so it is a prayer. In fact, we're answering Amen to it, even. We are hoping that there is some sort of blessing involved, but it's not a blessing in the sense of using the formula of Baruch. And I'll add even one more thing to it, which we'll talk about more next week, is that a blessing in Jewish tradition, the idea of bracha, is there's God blesses us, gives us, whatever it is, that whether we need physical sustenance or spiritual sustenance or however you understand it, that there's a sustaining aspect to it, that you're bringing, that the bracha is that God is giving is bringing down some sort of divine light or help. Um, and when we bless God, we're in a sense returning it. It's the spiritual ecology that God gives us blessing. That's why there's a famous line in the Talmud that if you eat food without making a blessing first, it's kind of like you've stolen from God. It's like they use the same word for steal. If you were to steal something from the temple, that it's the same transgression, and that in the sense that you're giving the energy back to the system. You're allowing the new blessings to come, and we're going to actually for Tu B'Shvat in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk more about that because the blessings for the Tu B'Shvat Seder really, and the texts of revolving around the Tu B'Shvat Seder talk about that. So there's a difference. A prayer is a more general idea. It's not necessarily a blessing. A blessing is a specific type of prayer.
Can I
Yes,
just ask a quick question? Yeah, if
sure.
this is not going off too much on a tangent, why do we do the bowing for the
Well,
Baruch Atah Adonai in places in the
we'll get,
Amidah, but not in normal parts of the other parts of the service?
that's a great question. We'll get to that actually. The bowing is definitely because we're going to talk about the choreography in just a moment. So, um, okay. All right. Okay. And just to go on a bit more with the structure, the first 3 blessings of the Amidah and the last 3 blessings of the Amidah are pretty much always the same. So, the it's the middle blessings that really, that's where you know what day you're on. Now there are additions that you could put in the first 3 blessings and the last 3 blessings, specifically for like high holidays, especially if it falls during the week. Like say if it's Shabbat Shuvah, meaning the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you would still add things like Zachrenu L'Chaim and things that get added during the high holidays. Um, and for the last 3 blessings, there's also this addition during Hanukkah and Purim of of it's called why am I right in front of me and the name is blank blanking the name, but There, just pull this out for just a second. Sometimes English, yes, Al Hanisim. Sometimes English evades, evades me. The Al Hanisim language evades me. Um, so those are always the same. They also all have this "guard my lips, Elohai Tzor" prayer at the end. We'll talk about that later. But I just want to, structurally speaking, those first three blessings, those last three blessings are always the same. So you always kind of know what you're doing. And in addition, the first three blessings are the ones where you're supposed to have the most intention. If you lose track of things during the later ones, you don't have to worry about it. But if you get totally distracted in the middle of the first blessing of the Amidah, the tradition is that you should actually go back and repeat that. Okay. All right. So now I want to talk about sort of posture, choreography. In terms of understanding the spiritual nature of this prayer, it's you can't avoid the fact that there's definitely a choreography to it. Um, okay. So the first thing is that we're standing. And I actually think there's a lot behind the fact that this prayer is standing. And so much of Jewish prayer is stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. Uh, so what does standing mean in Jewish tradition? So I just want to point out one of the first things that it means. It's, I think, a very practical way in which we think about the world is what's the difference between human beings and animals? Human beings, we stand upright. And here we have in old creation midrash that, well, what happened on the Friday, the sixth day of creation, when human beings were created? So it goes through, first hour the dust was gathered, the second it was formed, you get the word golem there. The limbs are stretched out, breathes into Adam, and then he stands on his feet, Amad al Raglav. There's some other interesting ones in this story, but I don't want to get too distracted. But standing on your feet is a very human thing. So meaning number one is it's a dignified stance. It's what it is to be human as opposed to animals. We also find in traditional sources when people were to speak in stories, people who speak their truth will say, Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and said, Ahmad Rabbi Yeshua Raglav Amar, and he said X, Y, Z. God, you know that I am, that I didn't do this for for my honor or the house of my forefathers. Um, and then finally, we start talking about bowing. We'll get more into bowing, but the bowing and the bodily supplication is the opposite of it. In fact, the one of the major prayers of supplication, which we call tachanun today, is often called nefilat apayim. Today, people, when they do tachanun, they sort of like lie down on their arm. If you've ever seen that in some synagogues during weekday prayers, people will lie down on their arm in this supplication. But originally, people would sort of prostrate themselves, lean to the left a little, and do their supplications that way, this prayer to God. So in that regard, it's contrast then, it's giving up that dignity. And we'll get more to bowing as well a bit later, but standing is a form of human dignity. It's a human stance. Then there's respect. Several other, like you stand in court in Jewish law, both litigants and witnesses at different times stand in a Beit Din, but the judges sit. And much like we're standing, God is a king, God is a judge, so we're standing in court, so to speak. We're standing in God's court. Same in the temple courtyard, that nobody was allowed to sit in the temple courtyard except for the house of David, meaning the kings of the house of David. And there's even a debate over whether they were allowed to sit. And then finally, you're supposed to stand in the presence of your rabbi or teacher. That is not a personal request in any way. Please don't. But I grew up in a world where if the head of the yeshiva came in, you were supposed to stand. And in fact, what people do is that, you're not allowed to, as the head of the yeshiva, give up your honor completely. So people would do this half stand. They'd like lift their butts off the chair just a little bit. So you ever in a place where you see where a rabbi walks in, you see everyone sort of like lift their tush off the chair for like a half inch. That's why they're doing it. So that's another reason. Obviously, it's respect before God. Then finally, there's mimicking angels. There are various verses in the Bible and also just traditions that human beings are the ones who walk, angels stand. We don't see angels walking. Maybe they fly, maybe they appear somewhere. Angels are described as having straight legs with no knees. Um, so it's also interesting, just an interesting bit of Jewish legend there. And for that matter, there's no sitting in the heavens other than God. I mean, the angels are always standing in God's presence. So, okay. Um, while we're just talking still about choreography, uh, and also about an opening line as well. The Amidah really before you get to that first word Baruch, there's a line beforehand. You know, O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Adonai svatai tiftach v'yagid tilatecha. Some places do a very nice song to it. You know, Adonai svatai tiftach. You know, you may have heard it. Um, before saying that line, the custom is to take 3 steps backwards and then 3 steps forward. And one of the simplest ways to understand that is you're really backing out of your reality as you experience it now. You're leaving the world in a sense of that you're living in, and you're then walking into the presence of God. And I think that's also just it's a moment to set your intentions right. You're about to be doing this this very important prayer. So you're setting your intentions and you're taking this physical action to recognize it. Just also to add that I think this line is also says a lot about prayer, the idea that we're asking God to help us pray. Um, you know, especially with the comparison to angels, we often say that that we quote angels from the Bible in our prayers because our own words may not be enough, or we may not feel our own words are enough. Last week we talked about using our own words, though, so it's but being able to find that inspiration.
I have to say, Rabbi, this is fascinating. I joined Temple Israel Catskill 2013 when my mother was buried.
Mhm.
So I waited the 6 months. We had her cremated for reform.
Right.
What was so interesting, I was immediately put on the board because of my experience with nonprofits. One of the first things I remember is the board asking why Rabbi Zoe was doing this in the Reformed Temple. And this is the most beautiful explanation I've gotten in 13 years. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to also just defend Rabbi Zoe, and her, I think it's a good thing. And I think this is what it does. It's you're doing physical actions to get yourself into the right mental space.
Incredible.
Um, Next, there are 4, and this now we could talk about bowing. There are 4 places in the Amidah where we bow. There's the opening Baruch, and I can I'll here. Let me just open up that document again so I can show you where it is. Um, one sec. Okay. So this opening Baruch Atah Adonai, and just traditionally, and listen to your back and your knees and your body. That they're the rabbi in your life. But if you are physically capable, the tradition is that you bend your knees at Baruch, you bend at the waist at Atah. So, and then you lift up, and you're actually not bowed when you say the name of God, Adonai. So praised, you would bend your knee. Are you would, bend at the waist, and then you'd lift up at Adonai. So we do that both at the beginning of the opening blessing and then at the end of the opening blessing. So the up here and down here, or up here and down here. And then we do it again much later. So here in the blessing of Thanksgiving, but there's a slight difference for when we say modim, which is in the which at Anshe Emeth we usually do this part silently, except on the high holidays. We usually do what's called a Hecha Kedusha, half where we read through the Kedusha and then everything else is silent. So we don't always get to say this part out loud, but the bowing happens at modim, and there is no bending at the knee because we're not saying the word Baruch. And one of the things about the word Baruch is it's the same root as knee. Berech is a knee. is knee. So we don't bend at the knee for this. You just bend straight from the waist and lift up again at the name of God, Adonai. And then at the end of that blessing, Mary said, like that's the beginning of that blessing. The very next where that blessing gets sealed, where the seal of that blessing is here, Baruch atah Adonai tov shimcha l'chan elodot. There, once again, has the word Baruch. You bend at the knee, you bend from the waist and lift up at the name of God. Okay. So what does that, first, what does that mean? I mean, because bowing is I think a very unusual, certainly in the West these days, and certainly in America. There isn't a long history of people bowing to kings, bowing to rulers, and it's something that feels. I know for myself, the very first time I saw somebody bow completely to the ground on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, because there is many people have that tradition, it felt almost idolatrous to me. Like what we're. And then, when I was in India, people bowed all the time. It was normal, all the way to the ground, spreading out arms. It was just simply, part of life. So I'm going to go back to sharing the slideshow. One sec. All right. Sometimes when I go to the slideshow, it doesn't let me, I can't actually see. Um, so it went ahead without me. All right. Okay, so first, just to show an image, you'll notice here, this is a place where I've seen people do different things, like at whether step 3 happens or whether you jump sort of straight to step 4. I've seen, people do both, but this is an image of bowing at Baruch. So just some points, just, even in the Amidah, bowing was originally all the way down to the ground. And I think the question of why do we do that in the Amidah and not in other parts of this, not other Baruchs, is that these are the ones where we are in the presence, where we're saying we're in the presence of God, and we are really like prostrating ourselves because we see ourselves in the presence of God. Whereas others, it's not that we don't see ourselves in the presence of God. God is everywhere. You can come up with you can understand God being everywhere at all times. But I think like many concepts, like everything's spiritual, but sometimes we need to talk about things that are spiritual, as opposed to things that aren't. Like everything's political, but there's things that are political and things that we say aren't, even if you can find the politics and everything. So here, I think the idea that we are in this pageantry before God, I think answers sort of very simply that question. But I think it also adds something to the Amidah that we have this extra physical practice. So I think it deepens the understanding of what the Amidah is. Um, so what is bowing? So, it's an ancient form of showing respect, right? We've kind of lost it. So also some of it is you're really showing your vulnerability. You're giving yourself over in this moment. I remember I used to take a martial art called Wing Chun. And I remember I had one teacher who would come every now and then. And if you were to, you bow at the beginning of class, and if you were to lower your eyes, he'd hit you on the head. And he'd say, never lower your eyes in front of your opponent. But what you can learn from that is that, well, when you are bowing in this respectful way, that you are lowering your eyes. You're not able to see in front of you, and that is a vulnerable position. So it's a sense of trust or vulnerability. But ultimately, for me, bowing is also about getting over yourself. Like there's a certain point in which in order to progress, to transform yourself, to do the work you need to do to be a better person, that you need to be able to give up on yourself a little bit. Doesn't mean always, and I think that's why standing up again when you come to the name of God is very important, because God, it's not about you're not bowing yourself. Once you recognize this sort of divine or infinite reality beyond yourself, that you are part of that. In fact, we're going to see an image later of that reminds us that we are made in the image of God, so that there is this moment of getting over yourself, but there is also this moment of, but you also quickly take it, you don't give yourself up. And I think to some degree that might be what was behind removing the custom, why we lost the custom of fully bowing regularly. Some of it may be just, the people around us were doing it, and sometimes we like to be, uh, you know, nunnakim, as they say, we want to, they're doing it, we won't. But I also think to some degree there's this idea, well, we're not supposed to be giving up. We're not supposed to be giving ourselves up completely. We have dignity as human beings. It's an important part of who we are. For each one, I also like to try and give, I'd like to try and give certain practices that are more meditative or mystical. And there is an interesting tradition that the Talmud, and you'll see, I actually do this often. It might be hard to see from the Bima, but so the Talmud records in Tractate Brachot that when Rav Sheshet bowed, he'd bow like a reed, but when he stood up, he would rise up like a snake. And one classic explanation is that he'd go down quickly, straight forward, going straight down, and then would get up sort of slowly. But the way in which I was taught to do it is you actually bow straight. I can't really show it to you. So you bow straight, bend knees, bow straight. And then when you get up, you curve and arch yourself up. And that's, sort of like you're doing your upward dog in yoga. And again, this is your rabbi is your body on this. So, if this is not something you can do, please don't. And I'm going to, there's people familiar with the writer Aryeh Kaplan. You know who Aryeh Kaplan is? He was a major Jewish, really outreach person. He wrote a lot of books that brought Judaism to just to people who weren't embedded in Orthodox communities, particularly after the 60s and after sort of the spiritual revolution that happened in America, where meditation and Eastern traditions became very popular. He sort of saw himself as a way to he sort of saw himself as a Jew, as a way to bring Jews into a Jewish version of that, and showing people that Judaism also has very deeply spiritual meditative practices. I'm gonna just stop sharing for a moment. I don't know, you can kind of see it. His book, Jewish Meditation. Maybe I'll remove the background at some point. But in his book, Jewish Meditation, he died very young. He died at I think he was 39 when he died. And I love his books, although from an academic point of view, I disagree with a lot of what he says in terms of like he's also very critical of other traditions because he's trying to be polemical. But his explanations of how to meditate and how to apply this to Jewish tradition are wonderful. So it's definitely, and it's on Kindle, I think, for like $3. So if you are Aryeh Kaplan, Jewish Meditation it's definitely a worthwhile read if you're interested. So one of the things he does is he talks about what in yoga and certain Hindu philosophies are called Kundalini energy, which is the energy of the snake. And that, in fact, in the ancient world, snakes, clearly we see in the Bible, there's this sort of sense of snake, like the snake in the garden. In the ancient world, the snake did represent certain divine forces. So he saw it. So he wanted to interpret this as anti that idea, but incorporating it. That instead of trying to use our lower animal half to send energy through our body, that we start by bowing down, that we're drawing down energy from our minds, from the sort of the upper parts of our body, from our mind and heart, or from the heavens, into that energy into our body before we then bring the more animalistic, the even sexual energies into our bodies as a mystical practice, or as a practice of envisioning ourselves energetically, if that makes sense. I don't know how many yoga people there are here. If you've done yoga and you've talked about like the idea that our body, that we'd be moving energy through our body, or Tai Chi or something like that, that this is one place in which you can see in Judaism a sense of we're thinking about energy moving in the body. So bowing could be yoga. if I had time, I'm not doing I certainly not doing this from the Bima, but I certainly when I've had sort of retreats with other rabbis and other people, I've actually done this as a whole practice, really with visualizing and imagining the energy as it flows through us. It's not for everyone, but it is one way to approach it. Okay. I want to get through a bit more, but I also want to recognize that there's about 15 more minutes. Um, just want to show a bit more and then open up discussion. Hopefully I can. Uh, yeah, sorry, I just need to do this twice. Otherwise it doesn't work. Okay. Okay. Just some more things in terms of just stance. There's feet together is standard. Some would say slightly bowed head. And I think one of the more interesting ones is that if you go to like a typical Sephardic synagogue, it's less so these days, but people will usually be standing still during the Amidah. I think that's also true in conservative and many Reform synagogues as well. Whereas other, you'll be swaying, shuckling as they call it, and that's the image of the Hasidic Jew, shuckling. That there's a lot of just raising of energy. There are a lot of explanations for that. Some of which are more racy than I don't want to go into too much, but that even the motion is almost like imagining that you're in the passionate love throes with God. There's a explanation of the Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, along those lines. But that the idea that the Amidah, even though we're serious in front of God, we're standing seriously in front of God, that there are those who say, no, we're still moving. We still have room to move our bodies. And I think that's an important thing to add. All right, I want to skip. We don't have a lot of time. I want to talk about Kedusha for just a moment, but just important thing, just practically for Kedusha, there are really three in the script of the Siddur for the congregation. There are really three lines that are meant to be repeated or meant to be cited. There's Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech ha'aretz kavodo, Baruch kavod Adonai mimkomo, and Yimloch Adonai Leolam Elohayach Tzion Lador Vador Hallelujah. That is in the Siddur pages from before. I can send that afterwards when we post the videos. We can post this and post the other document so people can follow along which lines those are. But those are meant to be recited by the congregation. They're all quotes of angels. And they're all supposed to be ways in. So that's why Kedusha is one of the most important parts of the service. Generally, they say like if you're in services, even if you're in a different part of the prayer book, you're trying to catch up. You should stop when Kedusha happens and listen. Okay. Another physical practice that goes along with Kedusha is that for each line that you say, whether Kadosh, 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 for each Kadosh, you actually rise up off your heels a little bit. And that's symbolically representing sort of the angels who don't walk, so you're rising up. And also the fact that you're raising yourself up from the ground, from sort of our base physical reality to something more angelic, which is not a simple concept. I think some people have very different ideas about what that would mean. And then again, when we say the next two lines, Baruch Kavod Adonai, and again, Yimloch Adonai Leolam, that just on the first word, you rise up on your heels. Okay. And then the final thing is that when at the very end of the Amidah, when you say Oseh Shalom Bimromav, that there's a custom of taking 3 steps back and bowing. I've seen 2 different ways of doing this. Some people take 3 steps back, then you bow to the left, bow to the right, bow to the middle, and that's kind of how I do it. Then there are other people who, as they're taking the 3 steps back, sort of for each step, they'll bow, like first step back, they'll bow to the left, second step back, they'll bow to the right, third step back, they'll bow to the middle. And there since we've been in the presence of God, we've walked into like at the beginning when we say those opening words, that at the end, now we're backing out again. And just as, you're leaving, we don't have this in our culture so much, where we don't bow. The idea that you're leaving, that you're bowing to God and you're bowing to the left and right of God, that you're being very humble as you back out of this moment, but you're also recognizing that an important uh, encounter is over. Okay. Um, all right. I want to just, briefly talk about how the first three blessings and the last three blessings are always the same. Um, the middle blessings, though, are different. And we at Anshe Emeth, we really only ever meet on holidays and Shabbat. And in fact, the only time that I recall saying the weekday Amidah at Anshe Emeth is at the end of Yom Kippur, where we do the evening service. But I think it's important for understanding the structure of the Amidah, because this was really even the Shabbat service and everything were built based off of the Shemona Esrei, and the fact that it's still called the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings. So the weekday Amidah is sort of central. And I just want to, if you ever have the chance to recite it, or if you're in a Shiva home, during a weekday where they're reciting it, or if you're in a service for the weekdays, the the way I like to approach it was from my teacher for pastoral counseling back in rabbinical school, who used the analogy um, of an intake form of something like, when you go to the doctor's office, you have to ask, the doctor's going to ask you all types of questions, even ones that are, ridiculous. Like, uh, you know, even ones you're like, me, no, he's going to ask like, do you have, are you, are you pregnant if you're a man? Like, they might go down the list. Uh, um, and that the idea of asking all those questions is it reminds people of what, because maybe you'll forget. And when you're doing when somebody comes to your office as a psychologist or something like that, that you might also ask things like, even if the person isn't suicidal or something like that, that you want to ask the question to give them the opportunity to answer it, because they may not answer it themselves. They may not think of it themselves. So the way which the Amidah is set up is it's meant to cover the basic needs of human beings, and especially the Jewish community as a Jewish communal prayer. So understanding or wisdom, repentance, what the difference between repentance and forgiveness is, interesting question, but asking for forgiveness, redemption, healing, prosperity, the ingathering of the exiles, justice in the world. Um, this prayer, this is the classic prayer that was added. Some would say against slander, some would say against the wicked. The prayer was probably written, that bracha was probably written in a time where Jews were living under Roman occupation, and there was this sense of if you turn somebody over, that you're slandering somebody to the government that could have a real impact in their life. The support of the righteous, the importance of Jerusalem, the return of the kingship, the messianic in our classic prayers, and then the acceptance of prayer, that God accepts prayers. And this last one is important because it's one of the places where if you have a prayer that doesn't quite fit into any of these, that you can say your own prayer here. But in any of these categories, you can really add your own words. So, prosperity, it's about the year, the agricultural cycle. But if you want to add in, and may my business do well, or, then you can add that in there. Or, if, for justice that you're like, well, I'm in a court case, something like that, may justice be seen, Um, but Shabbat only has one blessing, because Shabbat's not ultimately about that. And I like to say constantly that, on Shabbat's really the day where we are thankful for the fact that we have enough of our needs fulfilled to take a day off. Um, okay, and then finally, Elohai Netzor, that last paragraph, God guard my lips, that's also a place where people have traditionally put in personal prayers. Okay. I'm gonna just share finally uh, some of the meditative practices that go along with the Amidah that I've encountered. Um, Many Hasidic sources will go beyond simply saying, "Imagine you're standing in front of a king," but to actually trying to visualize it, that you've walked into a holy place that is before the throne of glory. Um, some even say you can envision, and this is theologically troubling for some people, but very common in Hasidic literature, is really even envisioning God physically, even though you're supposed to know in the back of your mind that God doesn't have a form, but that for people to envision God physically. But I'm less comfortable with that because I grew up being taught that that was a serious no-no. But just so you know, in Hasidic traditions, that's really there. Um, there are some who envision God, the name of God before them. And sometimes they'll do different colors or they'll imagine different ways in which the name of God appears. There's very Kabbalistic materials on this. Some will even imagine God with different vowels, Hebrew vowels attached to the Yud, He, Vav, He of the name. And something that I've seen more recently and is a big part of my practice is mapping the name of God onto our own body, that we are made into the image of God. I'm going to show some pictures of both. Here's one of mapping onto their own body. This is from Marsha Prager, and here in the corner, Deborah Kellman and Larry Kushner. Um, and what I thought was sort of cool, like the idea that if you imagine like this is your head and this is sort of the torso and the spine and these are, your legs, that there is this way to map it onto you. And imagine, I am in the image of God, and that I'm both praying to God, but also seeing God in myself. Um, for me, I like to when I do this, I will envision when I'm saying the opening blessing, I will actually for the four words of blessing, sort of imagine the yud in my sort of inside my head, sort of in my forehead, and I'll imagine basically what's on this picture. The picture to the right is an example of people thinking about God, different permutations of the name. It's hard, it's a little fuzzy, but you'll see here that here's the two names up here are yeah, which is the name from a couple parshiot ago in the Torah, where God asks, where God introduces his name as I will be what I will be, or I am that I am. He says yeah, sure, yeah. And of course, the Tetragrammaton Yud He Vav He is a very classic name of God. If you look here, there are different vowels. Like here's the Yud, here's the He, there's a Vav, there's a He, and then there's the vowel, the U, the kubutz, which is in between each one. And here you see again the same vowels repeated, and that people would do this and they'd visualize this as they're praying. Sometimes people get really deep. This is simple. This is simple in terms of the types of visualizations. There are prayer books from the 16th century, the 17th century, where there's whole like basically mandalas, if you know from Tibetan Buddhism, like where there's all these interesting structures of the name of God that they'll imagine, and they'll even line up in community. If you have a minion of people, they'll have people standing while they're saying the Amidah in the shape of the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life of the Sfirot. I don't have a picture of that currently, but just, people really approach this material very differently. Okay.
It's interesting. That mapping reminds me a little bit of where the Tefillah go, the strap.
Yes. Yeah, I think and that's also, that's definitely purposeful. I'm going to end also, we have a couple minutes. I want to end with a final meditation that I often do at the end of the Amidah. And it's a meditation because the last blessing of the Amidah is the word shalom. And if you can, didn't end up on my slideshow, so I can't show it, but here, I just, maybe I'll put in the chat. It's not big enough to put in the chat. So I know not everybody here can I know is familiar enough with the letters to envision them. So if you have a chance, the next time you look at a Siddur, though, you can see that the word for peace, it's four letters. The first letter, Shin, is for people who study the mystical meanings behind Hebrew language, whether that's, I have different opinions on it. The academic in me is like, okay, that's all cute. And then, the very religious part of me is like, finds a lot of meaning in it. The letter Shin is the major consonant sound for fire, Esh. And then the last letter of the word shalom is mem, and that's the major consonant sound for mayim, for water. And it appears in that word twice. And that peace, there's sort of a meditation on the word peace. The middle letters, lamed and vav, are actually, lamed is sending you towards something, it's two, and the vav is a conjunction, and. Um, so the idea behind the word peace is that it's not just peace isn't getting rid of the people who disagree with you or getting rid of the people who make you uncomfortable. It's the ability of people who you might think are opposites or things that you might think are opposing to actually be able to be in harmony and to add to each other. So the meditation that I was taught is one of the earliest I was ever taught when I was 14. You begin by imagining the letter shin, envisioning it again inside, sort of inside your head, in the middle of your head, and that sort of spinning, and that it's on fire. And even the way the shin looks, it kind of has flames. That you imagine that sort of slowly going down, and then the lamed makes up your torso, and the lamed is actually spinning. And those who were in the Torah study class, not this, the week before, Rabbi Zoe brought in a pendant, a necklace of a lamed, and it was a mirror image lamed. It was the letter on both. It was reversed, so it looked almost like a dreidel. Um, on both sides, and that's actually the same. That's the same image that I was taught to imagine in the meditation. But there, I was taught to imagine it spinning. But the result was that the lamed ended up on both sides. That you imagine the shin going through that lamed through your body, and then the vav, which is straight. Those are your legs. And those root into the ground, and actually in the ground is almost like a cup, is the mem sofit, which has the water in it. You sort of imagine the fire going into that water, but that the fire doesn't douse, and it doesn't make the water steam away. Rather, it joins together, and that you have both sort of the warmth and coolness, the refreshingness, and the ability, all the things that you get from fire and water working together. And that I will do when I have time when saying the word shalom, and at the end of the Amidah. Right. We don't have a lot of time left, but thank you. Are any questions or comments on this? Did a lot of talking today, as opposed to last time.
I thought it was very interesting you bring up the snake. Last week I was online with Barrett Shalom's Torah study with Reb Deb. And at the end, Steve Abelman, one of the congregants, brought up the whole idea of the snake. And I can't tell you how much, for 10 minutes, how much time we spent on the iconography of the snake in the Torah and in Kabbalah. It was amazing.
Oh yeah, there's a lot in the ancient world. It's a huge part of iconography there as well, and there's definitely some dialogue going on. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, I hope today was useful. I hope that you can take something from this so that next time you're in services, you can either follow along better or have something to do. I think part of my problem with services is that, I never know how long the Amidah should be, because if you do all of this, if you really focus on all of these elements of the Amidah, you can take, I mean, I've personally said the Amidah in 20 minutes. I spent 20 minutes on the Amidah, and I wasn't and I ended before some other people, so on the one hand. The other hand, if I were to, I know for myself, if somebody were to take 20 minutes for the Amidah in a random synagogue setting, it would be very annoying. Um, and I think that's an important discussion of how much time to spend on the silent Amidah, because it is such an important part of our service. On the other hand, not leaving people wondering what the hell's going on during services, because the rabbis decided to meditate on the name of God for 20 minutes. So I think that's an important conversation to have. But hopefully this is useful. And next week we will be looking at other parts of the Siddur, and sort of the general structure of the Siddur, and some practices related to that. Right. Anything else, or anything? There are no services at Anshe Emet this week. I know that. And next week, 6:30, same length here. And we'll be having services at Anshe Emet next Saturday. which is I believe the 31st. And we'll be doing a Tu B'Shvat Seder after services. And some of the issues I talked about today will come up then as well. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.